Welcome everybody! Today we are going to be covering the matter of could Alexander the Great conquer Rome? On the side of Alexander will be me, Possible History, and on the side of Rome will be Livy the historian. So who is this Livy? Like I mentioned, he was a Roman historian, which is obviously important to keep in mind in terms of his biases in this matter, who was also a close friend to Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Now he is important because he wrote the book Up Urbe Condita, and pardon my Latin there. This book is essentially a great piece of Roman history, going all the way back from the founding of Rome to the present day for Livy himself, aka the time of Augustus. This book is incredibly important for our understanding of Roman history, but today it's even more important for this passage, a section on Alexander the Great, where Livy says, "Our soldiers, heavy laden with arms, may reasonably fear a body of cavalry or arrows, defiles of difficult passage, and places impossible to convoy. But they have defeated, and will defeat, 1,000 armies more formidable than those of Alexander and the Macedonians." Now this is a concluding section of a larger piece where Livy presents his arguments as to why Alexander the Great wouldn't be able to conquer Rome. Today, we are going through his argumentation, explaining what he meant, and then I'm going to try to rebuke these arguments. So, let's get started. The setting is very simple. Alexander has already conquered Persia, and this will become important later, and he turns around to try to conquer Italy next. Now, Livy's first argument is that Alexander didn't really have a serious opponent. Yes, he conquered Persia, and yes, Persia was big, but also Persia's leadership was weak and effeminate, aka female-like. Their kings paraded around with eunuchs and women, he was dressed in gold and purple, and he was more concerned with showing that he was king than actually leading his armies. So obviously, Alexander the Great would have no issue trouncing the floor with this king of Persia. Livy also argues that after Alexander managed to conquer the Persian Empire, Alexander himself became effeminate. This is after Alexander has conquered Persia, and as such, the Alexander that Rome will be facing is not the same Alexander that faced the Persians. Then we have argument 2, undefeated. This is something that people like to claim about Alexander. He's a completely undefeated military general, uncomparable to anyone else. But what does this mean? Alexander died in his 30s. He came to power when he was only 18 years old. That gives him a track record of about 10, maybe 15 years of military experience. Is that enough to determine that you're undefeated? Let's compare this to Rome, which has 800 years of straight victories. Sure, they lost a couple of victories, but when has Rome lost a major war, especially a major defensive war? Alexander's record is completely meaningless. Of course he would go undefeated, he was fighting the weak Persians, and he only had 10 years. He didn't really have any real opponents to lose to. In contrast, Rome had many generals, which by disqualification went undefeated as well. Another thing Alexander has going for him is that leading his army is easy. He's an absolute monarch, everybody has to listen to him. Of course he's gonna achieve some victories. In contrast, Roman generals are way better at adapting. It's difficult to be a Roman general. You need to have political intrigue, you need to ensure that you actually stay in power, you need to contend with weak legions, untrained soldiers, the Senate not liking you, etc, etc. It's way more difficult. What does this mean? The moment Alexander dies, because he's the absolute monarch, Macedon collapses. The invasion is over. If a consul dies, Rome just elects a new one and the fighting continues. Which leads us to argument 3. Rome had about 10 legions at this time, which is around 50,000 soldiers and 400,000 allied cavalry. This is quite a formidable force. What are they going up against? Alexander with about 30,000 soldiers and 4,000 cavalry. Now of course he may bring some Egyptians or Persians with him, but these will barely do anything as they are too weak and effeminate. Argument 4. Rome has the home field advantage. All of Italy by this point is either Rome itself or a Roman aligned state. This makes for far more difficult fighting. Like I mentioned before, it's the same as with losing the general. The moment Macedon loses a major battle, they are gone. Rome is gonna wipe their entire army out. If Rome loses a battle, they simply retreat to their most nearby camp and they find a new legion to field. Which leads us to argument 5. War tactics. Legions are simply more mobile than the phalanx. Legions also have more independence for each individual soldier, while the phalanx has to fight as one cohesive unit. This makes the legions far more mobile and flexible to deal with the challenges they face on the battlefield, especially since the Romans already know the region far better than the Macedonians do. This will translate to a massive battlefield advantage for the Romans. Similarly, Rome has a throwable javelin, while Macedonian spears are large and unwieldy, and again only meant to be used in massive formations. Rome also has strong shield walls, and they have better and longer swords. The moment phalanx combat is no longer possible for Macedonia, Rome is going to wipe the floor with the Macedonians. Argument 6. Historical examples. We know that Rome can struggle. They have done so before. The First Punic War took Rome 24 years of hardship, losing fleet after fleet, losing a couple legions. It all didn't matter. Rome came back and back and back, and they won this first war. Second Punic War, similar story. Hannibal, one of the greatest generals of all time, was rampaging around Italy, destroying legion after legion, and Rome kept bouncing back. Rome doesn't get defeated easily. And in regards to the legion versus the phalanx, we even have historical evidence that the legion wins this conflict. The Macedonian Wars. Rome has conquered Macedonia. Rome has fought Macedons. Rome has fought phalanxes, and Rome has won. Then the final argument is Carthage. It is very well possible that Carthage at this time had a defensive treaty with Rome and would come to the aid of the Romans to prevent a Macedonian conquest. Those are Livy's points as to why Rome would win the engagement with Alexander the Great. Now I'm going to respond to these points and explain to you why Livy may be wrong, misinformed, or simply lying about certain aspects. First, argument 1. Alexander never faced a real opponent because Persia was effeminate and weak, and after victory, so was Alexander. This is very much debatable. Though it must be said, Persia faced Alexander with a 4-1 advantage in certain battles, and Alexander still came out ahead. It is undoubtable that yes, Persia had relatively lacking leadership at this point. It is an open debate as to whether this is because of decadence or because of other factors, but it cannot be denied that yes, the Persians had serious issues here. But it must also be said that much of our vision of the Persians during this time came from the Greeks. And the Greeks hated the Persians. They disliked them because they were invaded a couple of times, and Alexander the Great represented the great revenge. And so it is arguable just how bad of a situation the Persians were in at this point. I think that Livy here is giving too much credit to the Greek sources hating on the Persians and too little credit to Alexander's innovative tactics, which absolutely made a massive contribution to his victory during this war. This same vision of Greek racism towards Persia and to a lesser extent Egypt, we've also seen during the troop section, where Livy essentially dismisses all of the Egyptian and Persian forces that Alexander may muster because they are automatically weak. Argument 2. Alexander died in his 30s, Rome has a string of victories, so Alexander's record is meaningless, and ruling as an absolute monarch is easier than the consuls of Rome. These are all pretty pointless arguments from Livy. They all relate to commanders of the past. What really matters is who would lead Rome during this time around 320 BC. Luckily, we know this, or at least we know one of the key military men at this point. Lucius Papirius Cursor, who was a very capable commander. At least, he was a very capable commander during the Samnite Wars, a war against a neighboring region in Italy. But it should also be recognized that fighting the Samnites, a local Italian region, should not be compared to fighting Macedon, who at this point had the largest empire on earth. Which leads us to argument 3, where Rome, according to Livy, can muster a larger army than the Macedonians can. I think it's obvious that Livy is massively underselling the Macedonians here. Alexander's empire, at this point, had around 20 million people. Rome had around 750, 250 of which were of male military age. Livy here uses Alexander's army before he invaded Persia, and he dismisses any additional armies he could have gotten by saying those are Persians, those are Egyptians, they would be a burden rather than a blessing for Greece, or for Macedon, my bad. But I would argue that Alexander, in this hypothetical conquest, absolutely raises new armies above this 30,000 mark. There is no reason for Alexander to rush into this combat. He has to travel back all the way from the border with India to Greece anyway. If his plan is to continue to the Italian peninsula, he can and will muster a much larger force than what Livy describes here. Then argument 4, which I feel may be the biggest argument against Livy. Here is the situation as Livy describes it in 320 BC. This is a situation in reality. Quite a different picture to paint for Rome. If we zoom in, there are a lot of other nationalities during this time. In yellow up top, you have the Etruscans. In that weird shade of blue in the middle, you have the Samnites, who are already in an active conflict with the Romans. You have Greek city-states along the coast, etc, etc. Basically, Macedonia is not facing a strong, united Rome, they are facing a bunch of weak and disconnected regions. If Alexander manages to play them off against each other, fighting some, allying others, he absolutely has the upper hand in this conflict. By the time he even fights Rome, it is very likely that at least the south is already under his solid control. And considering Rome's reputation with the other nations, it is unlikely that all of Italy comes together in a major anti-Alexander coalition. So in this regard, Macedonia absolutely has the advantage here. Which leads us to argument 5, war tactics. The legions are inherently better than the phalanx. Here, I must admit, I actually agree with Livy. The legions are more mobile, the individual soldiers have more independence. In fights like this, in the Roman homelands, it is very possible that the rigid phalanxes can get outflanked and defeated by the Romans. This will mostly depend on the strategy used by both Alexander the Great and the Roman commanders, meaning that the war will be decided by tactics and numbers. I can already attest that in terms of numbers, Macedonia will have the advantage here. Tactics is more arguable and will depend on the internal situations of Rome and the alliances they make within Italy, but I would argue that Alexander the Great is at least a very capable commander. So while Livy is correct about the legion versus the phalanx, I think overall, in terms of the military situation, Macedonia is still ahead here. Which leads us to argument 6, the historical examples. Some good points are raised here by Livy, mainly showing the sheer determination of the Romans. Still, I think we can basically discard this entire argument because we've disproven it before. Rome's situation here is simply incomparable to the Punic Wars or the Macedonian Wars. During the Macedonian Wars, Rome already held control over the entire Western Mediterranean. During the Punic Wars, Rome at least held control over all of Italy, giving them far more territory to pull back to and raise armies from. We've seen the map before, Rome does not have this luxury at this point. Which leads us to the final argument, Carthage. The Roman-Carthage alliance is something I've never heard about, but treaties are cheap. Even if such a treaty exists, Rome themselves have broken such a treaty plenty of times before, and it is very well possible that Carthage simply doesn't come to Rome's aid. Now, I would argue that it would be a very good move for Carthage to defend Italy here. Why? Because having a major world-spanning empire on your doorstep probably isn't that great, and the Roman ships can make a massive difference here. If Carthage manages to block off the Macedonian ships and supply routes, that is a massive victory for the Italians. Still, it's very much up in the air if Carthage would actually do this, and it's very much up in the air if this would be enough to defeat the Macedonians on land. So, in conclusion, in my opinion, could Alexander conquer Rome? Yes, but it would highly depend on Alexander's conduct and whether he seeks allies. If he manages to align himself with the pre-existing Greek city-states, with the Etruscans, with the Samnites, and conquers the rest, then his conquest will be relatively easy. If he decides to make an enemy of all at once, well, he may face a significantly more difficult battle. Same with the decision made by Carthage. If Carthage joins the Italians, Macedon will have a significantly more difficult and more time-pressured fight ahead of him. To conclude, why is Livy saying all of this? What benefit does he have for arguing that Alexander could not conquer Rome? Well, like I said, Livy was a close personal friend of Augustus. And Augustus, as the new emperor, was going hard on Roman propaganda. Livy was part of this as well, with his massive history of Rome. And speaking from the perspective of Rome, a relatively new great power on the block, how better to prove your legitimacy than saying that you are better than great? Rome, according to Livy, was better than Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire, which automatically makes Rome the best empire, period.